Okay, thanks.
Likewise, Freddie, likewise.
Okay, well, thanks for doing this, and I'm going to introduce you, and I'm going to switch my camera off as my phone on mute, so I won't interrupt you. You have control, so if you want to make anyone a panelist, if you want to speak to anyone individually, or you want to bring people up on your screen, you can just promote them to panelists. Okay.
Okay.
Let me just introduce you. I know you've been, we've met in Las Vegas, and we've met before, and you know, and Brett's now the author of a book called Fully Booked, and you can find it on Amazon. If you really want to get your hypnotherapy business up and running and the best it can be, buy Brett's book. He's been a full-time hypnotherapist for 14 years. Is that right?
That's right, mate. Yep.
And he's a very busy practice. So he's gonna tell you now about metaphor and creative metaphor in trance, which is one of my favorite subjects, to be honest. I love working with metaphor. As you probably could tell, you've met me in Las Vegas. I like to tell a story wherever I am, even if it's the bar. So
of course.
I'm going to hand it over to you, Brett, but thanks again for doing this. Have a good time, and I'll see you later. If you want to ask me any questions, you can just, I'll be here. And if you want to speak to anyone on the panel or the participants, make them a panelist. They'll pop up on the screen, and you can interact. But I'll leave it to you.
Beautiful. Right? Okay.
Enjoy.
Thank you, Freddie. We will. And what a great day this is going to be. And firstly, I do have to thank Freddie for the invite to be part of this. And Trance Aid, it's a vehicle for raising funds for a wonderful charity, Save the Children. And Save the Children has been active internationally for decades, bringing safety, food, clothing, protection, education for children in the world's tough spots. North and Central Africa, Yemen, Indonesia in the post-tsunami, the Rohingya crisis in Burma, but I know that they're very active in pretty well every country now. So this is a fantastic opportunity for us 24 hypnotists, giving you 24 hours of trance and trance education. So all we're asking really is just give generously. And so thank you, Freddie, for being kind to invite me. And so I'm one of 3 Australians being part of this gig. And following me will be Richard Hill and then Matt Hale. So donate now. And I also want to thank the previous presenters, Derry Cook and Faye Lawand. Firstly, Derry, I don't think I've touched base with you anywhere, but with apologies, Freddie, but I think that was the best version of the arrow I've ever seen. It was brilliant.
I totally agree.
You still with me, Freddie? Yeah, it was. It was good, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Yeah.
It was amazing.
I learned something from Derry about the arrow, so that was good.
Yeah. No, look, it was a beautiful, gentle approach to the arrow. And I thought, yeah, even though I like to incorporate the arrow in a lot of my sessions, but after seeing that, I thought, wow, I've got to work on it. I've really got to work on it. But that was great. And so what can you expect from me from the next 50 minutes or so? And in essence, I love stories. I love reading stories, hearing stories, and I love to tell stories. And when we tell a story, it's as though we have opened the mind of the listener to the dreams of possibility. We have the opportunity to take the listener to a safe place in childhood, or in the absence of that, and we have to remember that some people don't have that safe place, but a place where the imagination can soar, where the minds would be just open to the dreams of wonder. So the conversation that I would like to have with you today is firstly, one for hypnosis practitioners, 2, people who are interested in hypnosis, but maybe they aren't working in the field. And 3, people who are curious about the power of storytelling. And the word curious is the word that I want you to hold on to, because my role as the hypnotist or the hypnotherapist is to invite curiosity. Curiosity of potential for change. And that's really what we're wanting to do. Is so over the next moment of time, I'll be talking about indirect hypnosis, direct hypnosis, and giving metaphor examples that can be applied successfully with your trance clients or patients, whatever you choose to call them. I'll also be using metaphors in the trance at the end. So who am I? I'm Brett Cameron. I'm an author of a new book, fully booked. Yep, that's it there. And I'm only going to give it a plug for a few moments, but fully booked, The Formula for a Thriving Healthcare Practice. You'll find that on Amazon or on my website, www.cameronhypnotics.com.au. But I'm not here to talk about that today. That plug's over. I'm a hypnotherapist in a busy practice, a fully booked practice in beautiful Newcastle, Australia. Newcastle is for those who don't know, it's a city of about 500,000 people, a couple of hours north of Sydney on the East Coast. And I just love it there. So I'm a gardener, a reader, a husband, a storyteller, and many other labels that won't get a mention today. But if there is a word that weaves its way into all of the above, that word is passion. I'm passionate about the work I do with my clients. I'm passionate about helping others to grow. But to cut to the chase, I'm passionate about life. You know, this morning I put up a photo on Instagram, Facebook, having a coffee with my wife at a local beach, and it's a beautiful spring morning here. Well, it was spring morning a few hours ago in Australia, and just so lovely just to enjoy being out in nature. And that's where we get a lot of inspiration for metaphors. But anyway, let's wind back here. So every session that I have with a client will have at least one story woven into the fabric of that session. So today, I'll be talking about the value of using metaphors, and then I will conclude with a brief trance where I'll be using one or two of my favorites. So we certainly will be experiencing some metaphor in work today. So I'll be working with indirect hypnosis, direct hypnosis, and weaving stories. So I enter every session with a client with a view that I don't have the answer. The client's conscious mind doesn't have the answer. However, the client's unconscious mind does have the answer. So we just have to open a few doors to find that answer. We might have to open some books to explore magical chapters that maybe haven't even been written yet. We might have to take the client on a holiday, to walk down a narrow laneway that opens onto a beautiful town square with a fountain where dreamers can toss a coin to make a wish. Then travel further, and along the way finding pearls of wisdom and insight. We might be on a space mission to discover new planets, new lands, new people, new opportunities, perhaps new approaches to a situation that hasn't been solved for a long, long time. We might take a journey into the past to gather lessons and take those into a future of your creation, because we're on a journey of discovering the value of applying metaphors. So how do people process information? There is a theory that up to 40% of the population are primarily visual processors. They can visualize. They can get mental pictures more readily than others. Another 40% are primarily kinesthetic processors, as they process information through their feelings and emotions, or perhaps they're very tactile. The other 20% could be a mixture of auditory processes, or maybe what I call ID processes, internal dialoguers. And these are people who just give me the facts, give me the numbers, give me the statistics, I'll make sense of it. Maybe a lot of accountants and people who work in finance, that's the way their brain is wired. But these people still have those beautiful things called imaginations. So it really doesn't matter. And I used to get hung up on this. Oh, are these people visual or are they kinesthetic? And it really doesn't matter. Because I've had clients tell me quite bluntly that I can't visualize. So this is going to be a challenge. But do they have an imagination? And to be human is to imagine. Therefore, 100% of the population have experienced trance. In fact, they could be living in trance right now. And there are theories that we're actually in trance almost 24/7. But what trance do we choose to be in? So let's discuss the use of metaphors and inspiration, because we are in the business of healing and hope. I see myself as an imagination builder or an imagination unlocker. Or I'm the guy who can just help you to open up the doors that you have kept securely closed for maybe a long, long time. I've been inspired by many modern day storytelling and metaphor building hypnotists, studying them, listening to them, learning from them. And as Freddy was saying, I've been doing this for 14 and a half, 15 years now, full time. And over the years, I'm always learning, always studying, and I'm thinking I'm about to hit 60. And I'm thinking, I've only just begun. I've got decades to go yet. So I have to strap on the seatbelt and keep absorbing all of that information. So one of the most moving stories that I have witnessed was from Mike Mandel. And for those of you who had the pleasure of being at HypnoThoughts 2019 in Las Vegas, you will remember his mesmerizing keynote speech. And if you weren't there, please do yourself a favor and check it out on YouTube. It is there, it's on YouTube. Not now, not today, because we've got something more important to do right now. Something of a more higher importance, something to do with being a part of Trance Aid and donating money to save the children. That's what you have to do today. But Mike, if you're listening, that was an inspirational story that you shared on that day. It was a story that could bring a tear to a glass eye. It was beautiful, and probably 800, maybe 1,000 people in that room. And I think everyone just went, wow, that was the story. And I just loved, there's all these looping metaphors and stories that just keeps going. And he just kept us captivated. And that is the art of a beautiful storyteller. Other contemporary storytellers who have inspired me are Stephen Brooks. I had the pleasure of studying with Stephen in Thailand about 5 years ago. Stephen's an expat Englishman living in Chiang Mai in Thailand, and I studied with him for a week over there. And yeah, he just has this gentle way of just weaving stories into a trance, and you can almost see this sense of wonderment on the client's faces. Mark Tyrrell, love Mark's stories, and I think I've borrowed some of Mark's stories and I've woven them into sessions. Jason Linett, he can just hold a crowd. He can just talk and talk and talk in a good way, Jason, in a good way. Frederick Mao, I had the pleasure of meeting Frederick last year. He was in Brisbane for the Australian Hypnotherapy Association World Conference. He was a keynote speaker, and lovely gentleman. And he just has this beautiful, gentle art of telling stories. Rob McNeely, great Australian storyteller, great hypnotist from Tasmania, and Freddy Jacquin. And also, I have to pay homage to my beautiful mentor, the late David Kennedy, to name just a few. And David was my hypnosis teacher many, many years ago, and just had a gentle way of telling stories. So these are some of the people who have influenced me, as in people within our profession who have influenced me. But there are people who know how to weave and loop stories that just keep you engaged and just allows your mind to wander. So for me, words are powerful. And when words are put together in the right context, in a pattern that gives the listener an aha moment, you have that golden moment. Think of stories from when you were small or not so small. As a child, you would be taken on a journey when reading or being read a fairy tale. You know, I have a memory of sitting on a mat on the floor in what must have been just after kindergarten. So it must have been year 1 or year 2 at school. And the teacher was reading from Alice in Wonderland. And I think it was probably my first memory of trance, where I think I was in trance with the story of Alice in Wonderland. And I don't know what my facial expression was at that time, but I can only imagine what it was, as I've seen that drifting look of wonderment in the faces of children and adults with whom I'm working. And as a practitioner, I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to gather together a library of inspirational stories and books that speak to you, that will give you rich resources of metaphors to draw upon that you can use in your sessions. So the process that I apply, it isn't about following a script. I do have folders of scripts. Oh, I've got one here. That I have to return to Karl Smith. I don't think Karl's been able to find it for years. This is Karl's scripts 1. I think I've got Karl's scripts 2 over there somewhere as well. And if you are watching this, Karl, I still love you. But unlike Karl, I actually like to read metaphorical scripts for inspiration. I then can adapt and create my own stories. And if you tell a story often enough, it becomes yours. I mentioned Mark Tyrrell earlier, and he has some beautiful stories that he has shared with people who've subscribed to his website. But if you can weave your own interpretation into those stories, just as I mentioned Derry Cook, his version of Freddy's Arrow, it's beautiful. And you can almost tell that this is Derry's interpretation, but it just works. The words just work so well. So where will I find metaphors? Or I'm asking you, where do you find your metaphors? So some of the well-used metaphors that we have, some come from books of religious instruction, such as the Bible or the Quran, Bhagavad Gita, the Torah, Buddhist teachings, the Tripitakas. So there are stories that have been woven around for years. And, sometimes we just hear ourselves saying words like, what have you found on the road to Damascus? That someone's just had this moment. Well, yeah, it's from the Bible, of course. And I'm also a big one reading up on literary and storytelling giants. And don't forget your own life experiences, because I know that the majority of my metaphors and stories come from my own experiences. And it is those life experiences that give you a broad table of metaphors of which you can taste and digest. But the trick is to make it a sharing table. And if we think of some of the literary giants, William Shakespeare, I mean, in Hamlet, we have the metaphor of death, where Shakespeare talks about death and the afterlife, describing it as the undiscovered country. What happens after death is like visiting a new country where you cannot come back to tell us what this new country is like. And I mentioned Lewis Carroll with Alice in Wonderland. You know, the act of going down the rabbit hole. It's a metaphor for exploring the new and the unknown. And it's a term that is used so liberally that people say, oh, I've just been sucked down the rabbit hole. Yeah, well, you have to be careful because you might find some pretty interesting things down the rabbit hole. Then we look at children's authors, Roald Dahl and J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter. There's a metaphor that I often use, which is, I'll be talking about later, but it's a metaphor where I invite the client to go into a library. And in this library, there's all these books, of course. And I'll fast track all the way through that. And it's interesting how many times at the end where we're just having a debrief and the client will tell me that library, it was something out of Harry Potter. It was almost like something out of maybe Middle Earth, Tolkien's Middle Earth. So it's interesting where the client will just take the simple words that you just deposit and they take it on their own journey. A few other great literary heroes that I love to read and talk about is Charles Dickens, The Story of a Christmas Carol, and A.A. Milne with Winnie the Pooh. And it could be said that every character in Winnie the Pooh is representative or a metaphor for a mental health label. Yeah, Eeyore is depressed. Pooh has an eating disorder, maybe even ADHD. Rabbit is potentially a narcissist. Piglet has anxiety. Because after returning from World War I, Milne wrote the book for his son, Christopher Robin. But it has to be said that Milne was suffering from shell shock, or in a modern sense, he had PTSD. And he wrote the book with his trench buddies in mind. Perhaps there was a therapy for him. But when we have a look at the characters in there are beautiful depths to those characters. And even though the book was written over 100 years ago, it is still relevant now. Ernest Hemingway, there's a lovely metaphor in The Old Man and the Sea, a metaphor for persistence. Santiago, he went 84 days without a fish, without catching a fish. And then on day 85, he caught a marlin. And it could be that we have clients who they're stuck. Oh my God, I'm not getting anywhere. And you just tell them the story and they realize, yeah, I have to continue. I have to keep going. And being an Australian, I love reading Henry Lawson, Banjo Patterson, stories about the drover's wife and the loaded dog. They're beautiful, funny stories, but so real, particularly for the Australian idiom. Walt Disney, of course, but then we cannot forget Hans Christian Andersen, The Emperor's New Clothes, The Ugly Duckling, the metaphor about how when we are different, it's more likely that we are either intimidated or even laughed at. And you hear people being bullied. I like to tell them that story. When we accept our differences with courage, we can see our true value. Paulo Coelho, Brazilian author, The Alchemist. I think I've read that book 4 times. The metaphor is that life is about the journey, not the destination. And I don't know how many times I referred to that book or the story behind that book when I'm weaving metaphors into sessions. American author Jack Kerouac, On the Road. The metaphor of the road. Each new town was seen in glorious light of new possibility. Denver, I can see ahead of me, like the promised land. I can see the greater vision of San Francisco beyond, like jewels in the night. If we have a look at Mark Twain, the stories behind Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer. I love John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath and Wrath, however you want to pronounce it, Cannery Row. Then we have a look at some of the other fairy tales, like the Brothers Grimm. God, those guys, what did they not produce? Hansel and Gretel, The Golden Goose, Snow White, Cinderella, Red Riding Hood. But one of my favorites, who I will be referring back to, is Peter Carey, Australian author. And I think it was the first book that I fell in love with, and that book is Bliss. I read that back in the 80s, shows how old I am. But what a beautiful book, and I've read it quite a few times now. And there's a story about bliss that I'll be talking about later, and it's a story that I sometimes weave into the sessions I have with clients. Another one is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. You know, the metaphor of the albatross that was killed by the sailor. You know, bad luck came upon the ship. The dead albatross was hung around the neck of the sailor as a burden to carry. It was his penance. And that's a metaphor that is referred to quite a lot in literature and just in general conversation. But it's also worth exploring lines from literature that not only speak to you, but they give relevance to the client. Yeah, it has to be relevant. So I've pretty well pigeonholed in my mind a group of stories that I will weave in. So when we consider that most clients are seeing you because they want to make change, they might need more resilience or more persistence. They might need to let go. That's probably the most common thing. They need to let go of something. It might be letting go of a habit, an addiction, or letting go of emotions, or letting go of old wiring, old neurological pathways that don't serve them anymore. And when I read some of my favorites, where sometimes I'll just throw out a quote. I've just got a book on my desk, and I just pull it out, just have a read, and to let clients enjoy that moment as well. E.M. Foster, A Room with a View. Life, wrote a friend of mine, is a public performance on the violin in which you must learn the instrument as you go along. And how real is that? Now, this one from Khalil Gibran. And Sand and Foam is the book or the stories that it comes from. And this guy is just full of so many metaphors. All our words are but crumbs that fall down from the feast of the mind. Thinking is always the stumbling stone to poetry. A great singer is he who sings our silences. How can you sing if your mouth be filled with food? How shall your hand be raised in blessing if it is filled with gold? They say the nightingale pierces his bosom with a thorn when he sings his love song. Wow, you know, how many metaphors in those lines? And then we look at another genre, movies. What's your favorite movie where you have been lost in wonder of the use of words? A favorite of mine is, it's an obscure Italian movie from 1994, Il Postino, The Postman. And if you can get it, you have to have a look. It's a beautiful movie. It's a beautiful story of a semi-literate postman on a small Italian island. I think it might have been Vulcano. That's where it was filmed anyway, on the island of Vulcano, down in the Aeoli Islands. And the story of the postman who became enlightened from his visits to this recluse Chilean poet, Pablo Neruda, who is living in exile there. And the movie is just littered with metaphor. There is one scene where the two main characters recite metaphor after metaphor. You're standing there as stiff as a post. Nailed like a spear? No. Immobile, like a castle on a chessboard. Quieter than a porcelain cat? And this just goes on, goes on. And I think when the first time I saw that, I was just sucked down the rabbit hole. I just fell in love with the words, and they have stayed with me. So let me share with you some of the metaphors that I like to weave into a session with a client. And I was watching a video of Anthony and Freddy Jacquin. They were discussing their use of metaphors and the fact that they have 5 or 6 metaphors and they just recycle. I'm with you guys. That's pretty close to my formula. You don't have to overcomplicate things. And some of my favorite metaphors is letting go. And I'm going to share this one with you, but I'm just going to read through the list of metaphors that I tend to work with, and you might be using similar metaphors in your practice. So letting go, which is the theme for a lot of the work that I do. So I'll be guiding you shortly. So this will be a direct hypnosis, I suppose, a library metaphor. Bonfires. I like to bring bonfires in where we can just burn stuff, burn stuff out of your life. Old words, using metaphors such as a beautiful autumn day, the leaves, some are yellow, some are red, some they cover the ground like a thick carpet. Some areas are quite sparse, but each of those leaves represents something that's been holding you back. Some of those leaves might represent disagreeable people or events from your life. They might represent subconscious wishes for failure, or there might be words from someone from childhood and somehow you're holding on to it. But wouldn't it be lovely if we could rake all of those leaves into a big pile and burn them out of your life forever? So I'll continue with that metaphor, allowing the client to burn those leaves. But then at the end of it, we have to remember that we have to return to nature what we take away. And imagine now standing there with a handful of special seeds. And there is a place in that garden where you instinctively know that those seeds are needed to grow. So with loving care, you tenderly plant those seeds in the garden of your life. You might sprinkle some soil over those seeds. Then you water them in. And then just leave the rest to nature, trusting yourself. And in time, those seeds will grow and grow. And how will you know that they're growing? Because you'll trust your intuition. And even before they have poked their heads out of the soil, you will know that those seeds are growing because you'll feel it. You're now trusting your intuition so much more and more. Another similar metaphor with that is sandcastles. And maybe it's an Australian thing because 70% of the population live by the coast. But most Australians have a memory of a childhood on the beach, building sandcastles. So I will be getting the client to imagine they are on this beach. It's a beautiful beach and the beach is quite deserted. And when they turn around, they notice there is a plastic bucket and spade that a child has left behind. And something inspires them to get down on their hands and knees to build a sandcastle. So they start by putting a spade full of sand into the bottom of the bucket. At which point they realize that this is a magic bucket, because in between every spadeful of sand, you can put a spadeful of your worries, your stresses, negative thoughts, unwanted patterns. It becomes the glue that binds the sand together. Then you put in more sand. And when the bucket is full, you tip it over quickly. You tap the bottom with a spade. And you've created a perfect sandcastle. So build another one. Start with some sand. Then you dig deeply into your subconscious mind, finding more worries and doubts. Something someone said to you as a child. Why are you holding on to that? Put it in the bucket. Limiting beliefs. Put them in the bucket. And when the bucket's full, tip it over quickly. You've got another sandcastle, and just keep building those sandcastles until you get to a stage where there are no more sandcastles to be built. And you find a stick on the beach and you place it in the top of one of those sandcastles. Might be like a flagpole. And finding an old t-shirt or a piece of paper, you create a flag and you write your name on it. And underneath it's got old stuff, just watching it flapping in the breeze. And you pick up the spade and you start to dig a nice deep moat around those sandcastles because we want to isolate them. And you pack the walls in tightly because you always want to do a good job. You feel so light now. You stand up and you look at them. You feel so light that you actually start to float above the beach like a cloud. And you're looking down at those sandcastles from a bird's eye view. They look so small now. You look all the way down to the south of the beach and it goes on forever and all the way up to the north, and you realize, wow, this is a big beach. And those sandcastles look so small. And you're looking out of the waves just rolling in, wave after wave, just rolling in. And then you see one particular wave, which looks so much bigger than all of the others. And you watch as it approaches the shore and crashes over the top of your sandcastles. And when the water recedes, it takes away your cares, your worries, your stresses, the old stuff. It's gone. Just like a grain of sand just rolling around with all the other billions of grains of sand. And the beach is calm again. And you float back down to the water's edge. And you start the first step in your new journey of life, feeling taller, feeling empowered, feeling stronger. Then you keep weaving. Another one is letting go. And it's a story that, it's a true story. And I love weaving true stories in. And this was a client who saw me quite a few years ago, and he was stuck. He was stuck. And he had been in Australia for 3 years. He'd been in Newcastle for 3 years. So he came from Pakistan, and he had his wife and 2 preschool children. And in Pakistan, he was an engineer, but Australia didn't recognize his qualifications. So he was working in a petrol station collecting money. He was probably bored out of his head. And he was stuck. And he'd been here for 3 years. And I asked him, so what do you do on your days off? And he said, I play the computer and I might play with my children. And I asked him, do you ever take your family to the beach? He said, no, I haven't been to the beach. Do you ever go to the lake? No, we haven't been to the lake. I said, so you probably haven't even been up to Port Stephens, which is a beautiful bay just north of Newcastle. He said, no, I haven't been there. He said, in fact, my wife wants to go to Westfield, which is a big shopping centre, a big mall. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy must be stuck. He hasn't even taken his wife to a mall in 3 years. So I said, come on, we have to get out of here. And we went for a walk up to the beach. I'm quite fortunate. I live 300 meters from a beautiful beach. And so we're sitting on a park bench watching the surf. And I was pointing at the waves rolling in. I said, so how would you describe those? He said, oh, they're white and tumbling. I said, there's movement, of course. And what about those guys surfing? What do you think they're feeling? And he said, oh, freedom? Yeah. And what about the children playing down in the sand? What do you think they're feeling? And he said, freedom? I went, wow, that's great. And at that moment, a seagull came and landed right there, and it broke our train of thought. And he looked at me and he said, I want to tell you a story from my homeland. It's a story about this a baby sea eagle who was afraid to fly. And it would sit on the top of the cliff all day long, just foraging in the grass for seeds and so forth, while all the other seagulls are out fishing and having an adventure. And it was doing this for some time. And one day when it wasn't expecting it, that sea eagle's mother opened up her giant wings, and as she was about to take off, she's accidentally bumped the baby sea eagle and was tumbled over the edge of the cliff. But to everyone's joy, just before it was going to hit the ground, it opened up its wings and started to fly. And I was watching what all the other seagulls were doing, and I thought, you know what, they're diving for fish. I'm going to do that. So I dived in about 6 times, missed, and came out the 7th time with a fish. And flew up to the top of the cliff, and all the other seagulls followed, and they had a feast, they had a celebration, and they were discussing what their adventures would be tomorrow. And at that moment, that sea eagle realized that it was just like all the others. And that client turned to me and he said, it's a good story, isn't it? And I said, Ahmed, it's a beautiful story. But do you realize why you have told me that story? Do you realize that you are the sea eagle? He said, really? Why would you say that? I said, well, why would you tell me that story? And we came back and did a little bit more work. And, you know, he sent me a text message about 2 weeks later telling me that we are about to leave Nelson Bay, which is Port Stephens. The children love the beach. Oh, by the way, my wife loves the Westfield. And I'm thinking, far out. That was beautiful. He had to let go in his own mind. I couldn't do the work. He found the ability himself to let go. Now, I talked before about metaphors in nature. I'm always looking at metaphors in nature. So over the next probably about 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you, or I'm going to guide you, this beautiful metaphor that I created when I was in Chiang Mai with Stephen Brooks. And the metaphor goes like this. So I'm not going to go through the process of guiding you into trance, but maybe if you do want to close your eyes and just allow your imagination to take you. But it's a story about, I was in Chiang Mai and I went to visit this temple, this particular temple. And inside that temple, there was an old man begging. And he had this bamboo bird cage, which wasn't all that big, but the bird inside it was quite large. And this bird was ruffling its feathers, wanting to stretch its wings to fly, but it couldn't. It was trapped. And this man was asking for money in exchange for the bird's freedom. I'm thinking, wow, this is quite incongruent. Here we are in a temple and someone's asking for money to release a bird that shouldn't have been there in the first place. And when I was leaving that temple, just outside the temple, there was this beautiful Bauhinia tree. It had these lovely white and mauve orchid flowers on it. And some people call the Bauhinia an orchid tree because of those flowers. Well, some people call it the butterfly tree because the leaves are shaped like the wings of a butterfly. And while this tree was quite beautiful, I could see that it was struggling. And when I walked around it, I could see there was a strangler fig growing down the side of the trunk. Now it's interesting, a strangler fig. A bat has dropped a seed in the top of a host tree, and that seed has germinated, sending an aerial root down the side of the trunk. You can almost hear it when its roots hit the soil, going, yes, I've made it. Sending its roots through the soil like tentacles, sucking out the moisture, sucking out the nutrients, denying the host tree what it needs to grow. And I was thinking at the time, what if we were to cut off the strangler fig at ground level, then we fertilize the bauhinia and water that fertilizer in, and in time there'll be lovely new buds, new growth, new life, new foliage. And that tree will come back and people would say, wow, what a beautiful, resilient tree. And if you could use the word confident to describe a tree, you'd say that is a confident tree. And nearby, there was a little girl on a park bench reading a book. And she had an older man with her. She looked quite comfortable, and I think he might have been a grandfather. And she was pointing at something up in that tree. I was curious, and I followed her arm to see what was there. And she was pointing at this beautiful butterfly. It had the most gorgeous colors. It was like a Monet watercolor, and the paint was still wet, just glistening in the sunlight. And it got me thinking about the life of that butterfly. Only a month earlier, there was a caterpillar on a branch going about its life. And one day the caterpillar, if you could read a thought balloon, would have read, you know, I think I might just sit here, wrap myself up in a cocoon, and I'll see what happens. So it did. So you've got a caterpillar wrapped up in a cocoon of comfort, just sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting. And if you're looking from the outside, you might think, well, there's nothing happening. But we know that the changes are happening at a deeper level. And one day when the time is right, and nature always knows when the time is right, that cocoon started to open. And out unfurled this most amazing butterfly. Think, how does that happen? That is a miracle. So you've got a butterfly on a branch getting ready to take off for the first time. How does a butterfly know they can fly? It doesn't have a parent or a sibling to teach it. It knows because it trusts its instincts. And there was a puff of breeze. And in a moment, the butterfly was airborne, and it was going higher and higher, up through the foliage, up to the flowers, tasting some nectar here, some nectar there, some rainwater was cupped over there, just free and alive, just bringing joy and happiness to everyone who sees it. And I'm just wondering, as you were wrapped up in your cocoon of comfort there, getting ready to break free, I wonder what color your butterfly wings will be. And you might also be wondering about the bird in the cage. And that's a lovely story. Everyone's a winner. The tourist feels good because they pay the man to release the bird. The man feels good because he gives the money to the temple. And of course, the bird feels good because it's free to fly, to go out, which is exactly what's happening with your unconscious mind now. It's out there exploring new possibilities, new solutions, new opportunities. So that's my beautiful weaving story. Now, how many metaphors were in that? And it just goes on and goes on. And I will sometimes weave that series of metaphors into so many other metaphors. But before we do run away, I do have to share a quick story of love. And I talked before about, in fact, there's two quick stories. Hope I got time, Freddie. Two quick stories about love, because people do come to you, they're feeling a bit hopeless or they're feeling a bit lost and so forth. Good, thank you, sir. The first story is about my mother-in-law, my beautiful mother-in-law, who was just around here about 2 hours ago having a cup of tea with her husband. Now, my mother-in-law is 85. Her husband's 96. Now, she was widowed for 17 years. And about 5 years ago, so he was 91, she went on a cruise with some family friends, came back with a springer step. And she said, I met someone. We're going, what? She said, yeah, I met someone. And so this guy was a widower as well. And they were actually family friends from many, many years ago. But he expressed his love. And anyway, they got married. They got married, and he took her up to the Gold Coast in Queensland for their honeymoon. And then when they're up there, he booked a Nile cruise. So they flew over to Egypt. So there they are. He's in his 90s and she's in the 80s. And I'll tell this story to so many people who are lost. Oh my God, I'll never find someone. I say, look, you've got plenty of time, plenty of time. But the last story I have to share, I talked before about a beautiful book that I read many, many years ago, and I think I've read it a few times now. Peter Carey, and the book is Bliss. And a lovely story in that, a lovely story of love. And this is a story for those people who are thinking, how can I find love? How can I explore all the possibilities? And this is a story about the main character in the book. His name is Harry Joy. And the lady he is pursuing, her name is Honey Barbara. So she's a bit of a hippie. She lives up in the rainforest, and he dropped out of his high-paying executive job and ran away to the rainforest. So Harry was rejected by her. But he knew the way to Honey Barbara's heart was to plant flowering trees for her bees, because she was a beekeeper. And 7 years later, there was a drought, a long drought. And his trees that he planted 7 years earlier had now flowered. And Honey Barbara's bees delivered his love letter. And I just think it's a beautiful story where some things take time. So we like to plant a seed and allow it to grow. And some seeds will germinate quite quickly. Some take a long time. But this is about inviting you into the depths of your mind to see, well, what seeds of growth can you plant in your clients' minds? And just guide them, help them, steer them, and weave those metaphors in. And I'm Brett Cameron, and I have loved every moment of sharing those stories with you. And I'm just looking at some of the questions people are asking. Will these metaphors be available?
Have you got a book with your metaphors in?
You know what? It's coming. It has to come now, Freddie.
It's come, Brett. Beautiful.
I think you have just planted a seed. That's what I've got to work on.
You've been planting seeds for the last 50 minutes, and they're still growing. And you spoke about Mike Mandel and his stories and his embedded loops, but that's the thing you just did with the bird in the cage and the tree. To be honest, I can't even remember much of it because I was pretty much gone with it. But it was beautiful. You've got to write these things down because they're gems, and it was beautiful, and I've loved it.
Brilliant.
And and you've been planting seeds for the last 50 minutes, and like you said, tomorrow an idea will come, and you'll think, where did that come from? And if you trace it back, it'll be because of one of your stories. I know it will be.
Yeah.
So it was wonderful. I loved it. Yeah.
Great.
So I'm sure everyone.
Thank you.
Did. And
it's a fantastic opportunity.
And being part of this.
Fantastic. And I also look forward to handing over to Richard Hill, another great Aussie, and I really look forward to seeing.
So far, it's been it's miles better than I could ever expect. We've got Derek, Bay, you got Richard, then we got Matt, and that's going to be crazy. So it's phenomenal, yeah. And hopefully
that's fantastic.
I'll be out there when this lockdowns. We'll all get together and we'll have a time. But I've got to thank you again. And
you're welcome, Freddie.
Beautiful evening. And I love the story about your mother-in-law and the trees in the rainforest. I have a story about just a quick story. It's a little bit different to your mother-in-law story, but there was a guy and his aunt was in her 80s, and she was on her own. So he set her up with a man in his 90s, and she got back from the date, and he said, what happened? She'd like to slap his face 3 times. She said, was he, what, because was he rude to you? He said, no, I thought he'd died. So anyway, that's my little joke for the day. But no, beautiful story. Beautiful story.
That's cool.
I love them.
Hey, Freddie, I've got to say one last thing. I love you, Freddie.
Thanks. I love you too, mate. Great.